so glad that you are joining us for this walk through Romans. We are going verse by verse through the book of Romans. And that's a difficult thing. I told you last week that my teacher in exegesis, my exegesis prof, told me that you shouldn't be exegeting or tearing apart and putting back together the book of Romans. He said, you're a good student, but you're not that good. And so Romans is a difficult book because there's so many questions, rhetorical questions. And we really need to stay in the mindset of the Apostle Paul. Now, what is the mindset of the Apostle Paul, especially in these first 7 chapters? Well, Paul is trying to convince the Roman people, both the Gentile Romans and the Jewish Romans, that they need Jesus. That's the whole reason why the Apostle Paul is writing this. Now, keep in mind, the Apostle Paul's never been to Rome. He's never had a face-to-face meeting with these people, at least for the majority of them. Maybe he met some of them in Jerusalem or some other place of travel. But he's never really been to the city of Rome and addressed the church in Rome. And so the Apostle Paul, now in verse number 9, again, we're in Romans, the 3rd chapter, and we're looking at verse number 9, and he says this, "What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we all have already charged both the Jews and the Greeks are all under sin." What's the Apostle Paul saying? Now, we need to understand that the Apostle Paul is not saying that there are benefits to being Jewish, or that there are not benefits to being Jewish. You understand that? Because the Apostle Paul has already talked about the benefits of being Jewish. So you say, well, what's Paul getting at? What does he say? Are we all better? And then saying, no, we're not. What's Paul getting at? Well, Paul is now talking about salvation. And Paul is trying to get the Jewish people to understand that what they've been doing is not going to bring them to a place of salvation. It's not going to bring them to a place of being in relationship with God. And so he asked this question, what then? And then he asked another question, are we better than they? Now notice the Apostle Paul is saying we. The Apostle Paul is 100% Jewish. But yet the Apostle Paul has a revelation of the grace of God and coming to God in faith. And so he says, are we better than they? And then he answers his own question. He says, not at all. Not at all. Now he's speaking very emphatically, and he's saying, no, that's in no way possible. You see, the Apostle Paul, again, is trying to get people to realize their need for Jesus. And the Jewish people have been trusting in themselves. They've been trusting in their heritage. They've been trusting in their own self-righteousness to bring them into relationship with God. And the Apostle Paul is taking that to task. He's addressing that major problem. Let me just say this, the Roman Gentiles also believed that their religions, their pagan gods, were that their works and their sacrifices to pagan gods were bringing them in relationship. And so Paul's not only taking the Jewish people to task here, he's also taking the Gentiles to task. You see, if you're trusting in your goodness to bring you into a relationship with God so that you're saved, so that you're delivered, so that you're set free from this world, you know what? It's not going to work. The only way that you can be saved is by putting your faith and trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. Now let's go back to verse number 9. And it says, not at all. For we have already charged that both Jews and Greeks are under the law. Jews and Greeks. What are they? They are under the law. In other words, the law is there and it's telling them you have not kept the law. You see, if you just break one of the law, one of the 10 commandments, you know what? You've broken them all. And so the Apostle Paul says it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or whether you're Greek. Now, the word Greek, we could actually translate this and say Gentile, because anybody who wasn't Jewish was considered a Greek or a Gentile. And so Paul says that I've already charged that Jews and Greeks are all under the law. In other words, we are all expected to keep the law, but the problem is this: we can't do it, and that's why we need Jesus. And then the Apostle Paul goes to verse number 10. And in verse number 10, he begins to quote out of Psalms 14, verses 1 through 3, and out of Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 3. And he says, "There is none righteous, no, not one. There is none who understand. There is none who seek for God. All have turned aside, and together they have become useless. Therefore, there is none who does good, not even one." None. There's 4 nuns in these verses. Not Catholic nuns, but people that are saying there is no one. There are none. First of all, he says there are none who are righteous. There's not a one of us who are righteous in our own selves. And then he says there's not one that understands. None who understands. We don't understand. You know, if you run into someone and they say, "Well, I understand the love of God," you know what? They're not telling you the truth. Maybe they understand a little bit about the love of God, but they don't understand the love of God. And then he says there is none who seek for God. Our natural inclinations are not to seek for God. That's why we need to discipline ourselves in times of study and in times of prayer, because our natural inclinations are not to seek for God. And then the last one that he says is in verse number 12, "And there is none who does good. There are not even one." Not even one of us really does good. So the Apostle Paul is telling us everyone needs Jesus. You need Jesus today. I need Jesus today. I've accepted what Jesus has done for me on the cross. Have you accepted what he's done for you on the cross? Thank you for watching. Join us again tomorrow as we continue our walk through Romans.